Elizabeth stood in the middle of her studio, looking at the man in the doorway. The man she had last seen 5 years ago on the Arno embankment on a rainy November evening. He had been sitting on the wet stone steps, soaking wet, his gaze dull, and she had stopped because she couldn't pass him by. She didn't know his name then. She only knew that he was frozen, that he clearly hadn't eaten since morning, and that there was something in his eyes that she had once seen in the mirror on the day she buried her father. She brought him a thermos of hot minestrone from a nearby osteria. She gave him a paper bag with bread and a piece of Parmesan. She put it next to him, said nothing. She left. She thought she would never see him again. And now he stood in the doorway of her studio, in an impeccable gray suit, with the same gaze, only no longer dull but attentive. And he held a folded sheet of paper in his hands. "Buongiorno," he said, in slightly accented Italian. "Are you Elizabeth Moretti?" "Yes," she said. "And you?" "My name is Khalid al-Rashidi," he said. "I bought this building 3 months ago, and I need to talk to you about its future." Elizabeth looked at him. Something in her recognized him, but her mind refused to believe it. This man in an impeccable suit, and that wet stranger from the Arno embankment? "Wait," she said slowly. "Have we met before?" He was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. "November, 5 years ago." "The Arno embankment," she almost whispered. "Was that you?" "It was me," he said simply. "And I didn't come just as the new owner of the building." Good day, dear ones. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Don't forget to subscribe and like. It's very important for the channel. Florence in winter is a completely different city than the Florence on tourist postcards. In summer, it is suffocated by the crowds. In July, it is impossible to walk along the narrow streets of Santa Croce without bumping into 15 Japanese tourists with identical umbrellas. And the line at the Uffizi starts at 6 in the morning. In winter, in November or December, when the rain carries the scent of damp earth and leaves from the Chianti Hills, Florence becomes like its real self, dark, stony, deep, smelling of frescoes and old wood. On days like these, it seems as if Brunelleschi and Michelangelo just went around the corner for coffee and will be back any minute. Elizabeth Moretti loved Florence in winter. She was 29 years old. She was born in this city, grew up here, left for 4 years, university in Bologna, then an internship in a restoration workshop in Rome, and returned here at 25 because nowhere else had she felt this special Tuscan stone, warm even in the cold, under her feet. Liz was of medium height, fair-haired. Her Romanian mother, Camelia, who had come to Italy 30 years earlier, had a say here. With gray-blue eyes and perpetually slightly dirty hands, covered in chalk, plaster, pigment, primer. A restorer's hands are never truly clean, and Liz had long since stopped worrying about this. She worked with her hands. Her hands were her tools, and tools should serve, not show off. The Moretto e Figli Atelier, Moretto and Sons, although there were never any sons, only one daughter, was founded by her grandfather, Luigi Moretto, in 1972 in the Oltrarno district, on the southern bank of the Arno. The Oltrarno district is the liveliest, most unreal tourist area of Florence. Here there are still master shoemakers, bookbinders, silversmiths, a few small wine merchants selling directly from barrels, and old Florentines who look at tourists with that special indifference with which they look at the rain. It comes, it gets in the way, but it is impossible to stop it, so there is no need to pay attention. Grandfather Luigi started out restoring furniture, then moved on to picture frames, then painting, then frescoes. By the time of his death, the Moretto e Figli studio had worked on several Florentine churches, 2 private collections, and received 1 small government contract for the restoration of the chapel in Santo Spirito. A small undertaking, but an honest one. Liz's father, Marco Moretto, inherited the workshop in 1989 and continued it in the same way, modestly, meticulously, with the feeling that every crack in the fresco that he filled was a small victory over time. Marco didn't like big money in business negotiations. He loved the smell of tempera, old tools, quiet conversations with craftsmen from other studios. His wife Camilla worked next to him. She was a textile specialist, restoring old tapestries and tapestries. Liz grew up surrounded by the smell of drying oil and turpentine, the sound of a fine hammer on a chisel, and her parents' quiet conversations about pigments and primers. She knew she would do the same thing ever since, at the age of 7, her grandfather first allowed her to paint a small section of a frame being restored under his supervision. Her childhood was quiet, homey, and very eventful. While other children in their Florentine neighborhood played football in the courtyards and watched television, Liz spent Saturdays in her grandfather's workshop, where he took her with him while her parents worked. Grandfather Luigi was a man of few words. He spoke with his hands, explaining everything through action. "Look," he would say, without looking up from his work, "the varnish has peeled here. Do you see the difference in the reflection? Here it's matte. Here it's glossy. Why?" Liz would watch, squinting. "Moisture got in there," she would say. "Well done," Grandfather would nod and fall silent again for half an hour. This school of silent attention remained with her forever. She knew how to look for a long time and see what others missed. Small cracks in the surface, unevenness of pigment, traces of other people's restorations from past centuries, sometimes unsuccessful, sometimes brilliant. She knew how to read other people's work like text. At school, she was a good student, but not an excellent one. She was too often lost in her own thoughts, looking out the window. Her best friend was Sarah, the daughter of a bookseller from Borgo Ognissanti, small and loud, the complete opposite of the quiet Liz. They had been friends since first grade, and Sarah spoke for both of them. Liz hardly had to put in a word, only occasionally quietly correcting when Sarah got carried away. Her mother, Camilla, worked at home. She took orders for fabric restoration, and old tapestries from wealthy Florentine houses were delivered directly to her apartment. Camilla was different from Liz's husband and grandfather. She loved to sing while she worked, and always sang Romanian folk songs, quietly, to herself. Liz grew up listening to these songs, and even now, when she was doing monotonous, delicate work, she would sometimes begin to hum something, without realizing that it was from childhood, from her mother. Marco's father was a smooth and kind man, without sharp edges. He never raised his voice, never came home in a bad mood, or, if he did, he would go straight to the kitchen and start cooking something complicated that required attention. He was an excellent cook. It was his second language, like restoration for Liz, like fabric for her mother. Liz remembered that the most important conversations in their family always took place in the kitchen, while her father stirred something in a large saucepan, and she sat on the windowsill, swinging her legs. She went to university in Bologna at 18, specializing in art restoration and conservation, the Bologna Academy of Fine Arts. Bologna turned out to be completely different from Florence, noisier, more fun, with a huge student population, the best food in Italy, and a completely different pace. Liz fell in love with it almost immediately, but in a different way than with Florence. Florence was as close to her heart as blood. Bologna was like a good book in a foreign language. Interesting, captivating, but you always feel like it's not your thing. There she had an affair, the only one during her entire student years. Andrea, an architecture student, handsome and unreliable, one of those who knows how to say the right words but doesn't do what he promises. They dated for 8 months. Liz was almost happy for the first 3. Then she began to notice discrepancies. He didn't cheat. He just wasn't where he said he would be. Didn't do what they agreed on. I forgot. It turned out differently for me. You take everything too seriously. She left quietly, without a scene. She said briefly, I need a man whose words and actions are one and the same. With you, they are different. Andrea tried to explain something, but Liz was no longer listening. After that, she didn't want any kind of relationship for a long time. Not because she was offended or broke down. She simply realized she needed something else. And until she figured out what exactly, it was better not to waste her time or anyone else's. She completed her internship in Rome at the Restoration Center at the Borghese Museum. A year in Rome, a completely different city, difficult and beautiful, with an imperial past that weighs on you from every side. Liz worked there under the guidance of the elderly master Sergio Conti, who, at 72, saw in the frescoes what others simply overlooked. He taught her, restoration is a dialogue. You're talking to someone who isn't there. Your job is to understand them, not to impose your own, to understand them. She always remembered this phrase. At 25, she returned to Florence. Her father met her at the station, hugged her, and said nothing special, just, well, finally, the city missed me. She laughed. Florence doesn't miss anyone, Dad. It's too self-sufficient. He laughed in response. That's true, but I was bored. They worked together for 3 years, father and daughter. It was the best time of her life. They understood each other without words. Like good musicians in an ensemble, everyone knew where their part was, where to give in, where to take. The clients felt and appreciated it. When her father died, she couldn't enter the part of the workshop where his workbench stood for a long time. Then she did, and left everything as it was. The tools in the same places, the unfinished frame in the corner, his old apron on a hook by the door. A year later, when Lorenzo came to work in the studio, she simply told him, "This table is a workbench. You can use it. Just put the tools back." Marco Moretto died 3 years ago. A heart attack, right in his studio, at his workbench, with a restoration knife in his hand. When Liz came in the morning, he was already cold. She didn't scream, didn't call for help immediately. She stood for a few minutes and looked at him, realizing that this was exactly how he would have wanted to leave. At work, among the frescoes and frames that he had spent his whole life healing. After his death, his mother went back to Romania. Her sister had been calling her for a long time. Age was catching up with her. Liz was left alone in the studio, alone with all the debts that her father never mentioned, because he was one of those people who believe that everything will resolve itself. The debts didn't resolve themselves. Liz literally survived for the first 1.5 years. She sold her father's van, took out a small loan, sublet one of the studio rooms to a young sculptor, Daniele, who paid modestly but regularly. At the same time, Liz got a job as a guide at the Uffizi Museum, 3 times a week, 2 hours a day, in English and French, for groups of 10 to 12 people. She led them through the halls and told them about Botticelli, Titian, and Raphael, the way only people who grew up among frescoes can, not from a guidebook, but from the inside. Tourists sometimes looked back after the tour and asked, "Are you an artist yourself?" Liz smiled. "I'm a restorer. That means I work with what others have already created. I think that's more important." Little by little, the studio began to breathe. Liz took on 2 assistants, a young restorer, Lorenzo, who had recently graduated from the Florentine Academy, and the elderly Anna Maria, a specialist in gilding frames, with whom her grandfather had worked. New clients appeared. Small private collectors, an American dealer, a Florentine family who were restoring a villa in the hills of Fiesole. Life became more even. Not easy, but possible. The only problem was renting the building. The previous owner, old Signor Bruno, had rented it out to them for next to nothing, out of respect for Liz's grandfather and father, with whom he had been friends for 40 years. Last year, Signor Bruno died, and the building was inherited by his children, who live in Milan. The children decided to sell. The house went through a Florentine real estate agency to an unknown buyer. Liz received notice 3 months ago. The new owner would contact within 3 months to discuss the lease terms. 3 months passed, and here he is, standing in the doorway. That November evening 5 years ago, Liz was walking back from the Uffizi along the Arno embankment. She loved this walk, 40 minutes along the river, with a view of the Ponte Vecchio, across which tourists with umbrellas walked in the evening. It was cold. A light rain had been falling for several hours. The Arno was dark and swollen, as it sometimes is in November. On the steps of a small descent to the river, not far from Ponte alla Grazia, she saw a man. He was sitting right on the wet stone, without an umbrella, in a coat that was already soaking wet. He was not sleeping. His head was raised, his eyes were open, but his gaze was going somewhere far away, beyond the river, beyond the hills. It was the gaze of a man who does not see anything around him because he is too busy with something internal. Liz walked past at first. She took about 10 steps. Then she stopped. She came back. He wasn't homeless. She knew that right away. He had a good coat, good boots, even though they were wet, a neat little beard. But he still sat on a wet stone in the November rain, and there was something in his gaze that made Liz know this man couldn't be abandoned. She wasn't the kind of person who rushed at strangers with loud questions like, "Are you feeling unwell?" and "Can I help you?" She was the kind of person who just did something concrete. She walked to the neighboring osteria, bought a large plastic cup of hot minestrone, some bread, a piece of Parmesan, a small plastic spoon. She put it all on the step next to him. He looked at her, not with surprise, not with gratitude right away, but somehow, slowly, as if returning from a distant place. She looked at him too. Dark eyes, deep, tired, traces of several sleepless nights. She didn't say anything. She just put the food down and left. At home, over a cup of her tea, she thought about him for a few minutes. Then she decided, If a person is sitting on a wet stone on a November night, it means something happened. I hope he ate. Then she switched to her own affairs and didn't think about it anymore. Khalid al-Rashidi sat on the steps of the Arno embankment that evening, trying to figure out how he had ended up there. He was 40 years old then, a native of Doha, Qatar, the eldest son of Sheikh Faisal al-Rashidi, one of the most respected Qatari developers, who built half of the new Doha in the 90s and noughties. Khalid was a man of the system from childhood. The right family, the right education, the London School of Economics, then a master's degree in architectural management at Harvard. The right marriage, the right career. He liked London. 4 years in student London, where no one knew whose son he was, where he was simply Khalid from Qatar, that quiet guy who knows a lot about buildings. These were, perhaps, the freest 4 years of his life. He discovered several things there that were later buried under a layer of obligations. That he loves historical architecture. That he can cook, by himself, for himself, alone in a small kitchen in Hammersmith. That he likes museums, where he can spend hours without talking to anyone. I returned to Doha at 26 because my father called. "It's time, Khalid. You've studied enough." I returned and started working for the family company. 4 years later, I became head of the development division. I built high-rise complexes, shopping centers, and residential areas. I built a lot, and from a technical standpoint, I did it well. Beautiful renderings, precise deadlines, and satisfied investors. His wife was Noura Avthani, from a collateral branch of the ruling family, an educated, beautiful, intelligent woman who knew what she was getting into. At first, their marriage worked. Both understood the rules of the game. Both were from those worlds where marriage is part of a family project and not just a personal choice. But Noura, unlike many women of her circle, wasn't ready to be simply a beautiful element of the interior. She wanted the real thing. Conversations, presence, attention. Khalid gave her money, travel, everything material she wanted. He just didn't give himself. Not because he didn't want to. He himself didn't understand how. His father never talked to his mother about anything personal in front of the children. His father worked. His mother ran the house. The family met at the table, and that was the norm. Khalid reproduced this model automatically, not knowing that others existed. Noura waited 7 years. In the 8th year, she came to him and said calmly, without hysteria, "Khalid, I want a child. You keep saying, 'not now,' but I understand. It's not about timing. It's about you not being here. I'm married to your schedule, not to you. I'm leaving." He didn't believe it. He thought she was bluffing, that it was pressure, that in a week it would all be over. But Noura wasn't bluffing. A month later, they signed the papers. She went to her family, then went to London. They said she'd entered a master's program in design. Then he heard that she'd remarried to a British architect. They said she was happy. It took him another 3 years to realize she was right. It didn't dawn on me all at once. Gradually. After several conversations with an old friend, Ahmad, who was the only person in his life who spoke honestly to him. Ahmad said to him one night at dinner, "Khalid, do you know why you don't have anyone close to you? It's not because you're bad. It's because you don't allow anyone to get close to you. It's a choice. Maybe not a conscious one, but a choice nonetheless." Khalid didn't answer then, but the words remained. That November he went to Florence, officially on business, and unofficially because he was tired. Tired of Doha, of his office, of the same faces, of the right dinners with the right people. He took a hotel room with a view of the Arno, and every morning he woke up, looked out the window, and thought, "This is where the people who changed the world lived." And I build shopping centers. On the last evening before his flight, he walked to the embankment and sat down. He just sat. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular. He only felt autumn, the rain, the smell of the river, and the quiet sound of water on the stones. And suddenly, food. He raised his head. He saw a retreating back, light hair, a quick step. She did not look back. He looked at the soup in the thermos, poured it, drank it, and almost cried from such a simple thing as hot food in the rain from a stranger. His wife's name was Noura. They married 12 years ago. A beautiful couple, respected families, everything right. But Noura sensed from the start what Khalid hadn't realized for a long time. She married a man who works, not lives, who knows how to build buildings, but not how to build intimacy, who, in the midst of a family dinner, answers a work call without apologizing. Who doesn't remember that today is their wedding anniversary, but remembers every figure in the quarterly report? They didn't have children, not because they couldn't have them, but because Khalid kept putting it off. "Not now, Noura. I have a project. Now's not a good time." Noura waited 7 years. In the 8th year, she told him, "Khalid, I don't want a child who will grow up with a father who is not home. I'm leaving." She left. Politely, without a scandal, with respect. They divorced the way good families do, without publicity. But something broke inside him. Not right away. First, he convinced himself that she was wrong, that work was life, that he was building the future, that she simply didn't understand. Then, about 3 years later, when he ran into Noura at some social event and saw her next to another man, calm, smiling, alive, something clicked. She was happy, truly, and he wasn't. It took him another 3 years to realize that Noura was right. It didn't come to him suddenly, gradually. After several conversations with Ahmad, the only friend who spoke to him honestly, Ahmad said one day at dinner, "Khalid, do you know why you don't have anyone close to you? It's not because you're bad. It's because you don't allow anyone to get close to you. It's a choice. Perhaps an unconscious one, but a choice nonetheless." Khalid didn't answer, but the words remained inside, like a crack in a limestone surface that wasn't repaired in time. It widened slowly, but inexorably. A year after the divorce, he went on vacation alone for the first time. Not a business trip, but a vacation. A fishing village in Oman, 3 days by the sea. He sat on the shore for 3 days, looking at the water and trying to remember what he liked in life, besides making deals and signing contracts. The list was short. Architecture, old books, the silence over the water. That was it. 2 years later, he began gradually changing the fund's direction. More culture, less pure development. It was slow, through resistance from his father, through misunderstanding from his partners. But he moved forward. That November, Khalid came to Florence alone, officially on business. The foundation was considering investing in the restoration of a private palazzo in Borgo Santi Apostoli. But in reality, he came because he wanted to experience the city he'd dreamed of since his university days. He was studying the history of architecture as an elective, and Florence wasn't a tourist destination for him, but a place where, in the 15th century, people learned to think about beauty as a system. The first 2 days, he walked through museums, churches, streets. He listened to the city. And suddenly he felt something. Something he hadn't felt for a long time. That life isn't just numbers and reports and square meters of buildings. That these walls, these frescoes, these domes, they were created by people who burned from within. But no, he hadn't burned for a long time. That evening, he left the hotel just for a walk and reached the Arno. He sat down on the steps and didn't even notice how an hour had passed. It was raining, but he didn't notice it. Then food appeared next to him. He raised his head. He saw the back of a woman leaving, light hair under a dark hood, a quick step. She did not look back. He looked at the thermos of soup. He picked it up. He poured it. He drank straight from the lid. The soup was hot, with rosemary and potatoes, with the smell of real homemade broth. He ate the bread with Parmesan, and for the first time in several days, he felt something very simple, that someone was paying attention to him. Not as an investor, not as a client, not as a sheikh, as a man sitting in the rain. He didn't find her then. He didn't try to look for her specifically, but Florence remained in him. He returned to Doha, but something had changed. He began to think differently, less about square meters and more about why. Gradually, the foundation began to move towards cultural investments, restoration, art, architectural heritage. He created a separate department within the foundation, Al-Rashidi Heritage, dedicated to the preservation of architectural and artistic heritage in the Islamic world and the Mediterranean. 3 years ago, he began coming to Florence regularly. He met people, studied the market. He met with restorers, gallery owners, and representatives of the Superintendenza, the state body for heritage protection. He realized that true art preservation isn't just about money, it's about people. Specific hands, specific knowledge, specific workshops. And 3 months ago, when his Florentine agent told him that a small historic building in the Oltrarno, housing a restoration studio, was for sale, Khalid went to see it for himself. He entered the building, looked around the workshop, saw the quality of the work, spoke with the elderly Anna Maria, Liz was then at a meeting in the Uffizi, and bought it. He also ordered a small investigation of the studio, a standard procedure before any investment. They brought him a short dossier, the history of the studio, the owner, the contracts. The photograph showed a young woman with blonde hair, cheeks smeared with white dust, and gray-blue eyes. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Something swayed within him, something very distant. The Arno embankment, November rain, hot soup in a thermos lid, a receding back. No, it can't be. It's too incredible. But he still went himself. And now he stood in the doorway of her workshop and looked at her, and she looked at him. "Wait," Liz repeated slowly. "November. 5 years ago. The Arno embankment. Was that you?" "It was me," he said simply. A few seconds of silence. "Did you eat then?" she asked suddenly. "Was the soup hot?" He was taken aback for a second by such a question. Then he laughed, quietly, like a man who had not laughed so sincerely for a long time. The soup was very hot and very tasty. Liz nodded, in a businesslike, satisfied manner, as if she had closed a long, open question. "Okay," she said. "Then sit down. Tell me what's going to happen with the studio." He was not prepared for such a reception. Over the course of his career, people had reacted to him in different ways, with awe, with servility, with undisguised calculation, with nervousness from the knowledge that they were talking to an influential person. She invited him to sit down and got down to business, as if his name and position did not matter at all, and only what happened to this particular workshop mattered. He sat down on a wooden chair at a workbench littered with tools, pigment samples, small test pieces of wood base, and several open books with bookmarks. There was a smell of turpentine and something dry, mineral, a smell he couldn't identify, but which seemed right for this place. Through the large window he could see the building's inner courtyard, an old one, with ivy growing over the walls, and an old well in the center, which had clearly not been used for its intended purpose for a long time, but was there because it had always been that way. She sat down on the edge of her workstation, crossing her arms. "The studio continues to operate," he said. "This is a matter of principle. We are not repurposing the building or raising the rent." "Who are we?" she asked bluntly. "The Al-Rashidi Heritage Foundation. We're dedicated to preserving cultural heritage. A restoration studio in a historic building in Oltrarno is part of our vision and not an unnecessary burden on our balance sheet." Liz looked at him carefully. She knew how to read people. Like a guide at the Uffizi, they spend 5 years training to recognize those who speak beautifully and those who tell the truth. "Why did you come here yourself?" she asked. "You have lawyers, agents. These things are usually resolved through them." He was silent. "I wanted to make sure that the man on the embankment was real," he said. "That it wasn't an accident." Liz raised an eyebrow. "I brought out soup to a man in the rain. It's a very ordinary thing. Any normal person would do the same." "No," Khalid said quietly. "Not just anyone. 30 people passed me that evening. I counted." She didn't answer. She just looked at him. "I'm not trying to romanticize you," he added quickly, catching something in her gaze. "I'm talking about business. I need a good restoration partner for several projects in the region. I want this studio to work with us long term. But I wanted to get to know the person first, not just the dossier." "What was in the dossier?" Liz asked. "That your grandfather founded this place in '72. That your father ran it for 30 years. That you took it over 3 years ago after his death, deep in debt, and never closed it. But the quality of your work is above average in the city, even though you charge less than most of your competitors." "We're taking less because we can't take more yet," Liz said calmly. "Reputations take years to build." "That's why I'm here," Khalid said. They talked for another hour. She asked specific questions, without unnecessary words. What projects, in what countries, what deadlines, what documentation and insurance requirements. He answered just as specifically. She didn't admire, didn't flatter, didn't try to impress. She worked. At the end of the conversation, Lorenzo glanced into the workshop. He always found a reason to pop in when he sensed something unusual. He saw an unfamiliar visitor and glanced briefly at Liz. She nodded slightly. Everything was fine. Lorenzo disappeared, but Khalid noticed through the glass partition that he was looking. As he was leaving, already at the door, Liz suddenly said, "What happened that evening on the embankment, if it's not a secret?" He stopped, turned around. "I realized I'm building a lot, but I don't know why," he said. And that's bad news. Liz nodded, as if that was a sufficient explanation. Sufficient and true. And did you do something about it? She asked. Gradually, he said. The Al-Rashidi Heritage Foundation is part of that. Good, Liz said simply. So the soup did help after all. He smiled, again that rare, real smile, and left. Liz stood at the window for a long time, looking out into the courtyard at the ivy. Then Lorenzo stuck his head in the door. Who was it? New owner of the building. And what? Everything is fine. The studio remains. Is that all? Lorenzo clearly felt that there was more. That's all, Lorenzo, Liz said. Go to work. Lorenzo left. But then Anna Maria, who had seen everything through the open door of the workshop, approached Liz, said nothing. She simply looked at her with the kind of look that only older women have, who know things about life that young people don't yet know. And she left without saying a word. A week after their first meeting, Liz called the Al-Rashidi Heritage Foundation and confirmed their willingness to collaborate. The foundation's lawyers sent a draft contract, lengthy, professional, and with favorable terms. Liz read it twice, consulted with a lawyer friend, asked for a change to one clause regarding responsibility for the safekeeping of the items, and signed it. Then Lorenzo called and said, We're working with the Qatari Foundation. Get ready for new projects. Lorenzo asked, What about that man who came? He's the foundation's owner, Liz said. Lorenzo paused. I see, he said in a tone that clearly conveyed more than just one word. The first work meeting after signing the contract was in a small restaurant not far from the studio. Khalid suggested it. Liz accepted. The restaurant was just right. Quiet, with good food. No pretensions. The waiter brought the menu. Liz ordered in Italian, and without a pause, Khalid did the same, adding, No wine, please. The waiter wasn't surprised. Liz wasn't either. Do you often come to Florence? She asked. 3 or 4 times a year. Always on business. Never enough. I miss this city. What do you like about him? He thought. That it doesn't apologize for its past. It just is. With Brunelleschi's dome and the market on San Lorenzo, and all that traffic jam on the Ponte Vecchio. All together, not divided into tourist and real. Liz nodded. Most visitors to the city think differently. They think the touristy Florence isn't the real thing. What do you think? I think the Uffizi is as much a part of Florence as that bakery around the corner from my house that's open until 5 in the morning. Just on a different scale. Both are real. Khalid looked at her with an expression as if she had said something that he had been thinking about for a long time, but had not formulated. Do you always talk like this? He asked. How? Exactly. Nothing extra. It's from work, Liz said. When every extra stroke can ruin someone else's work, you start economizing on your movements. And your words, too. They ate, talked about projects, then about Florence, then about architecture in general. When they parted, Khalid said, Thank you for dinner. It was a work meeting, Liz corrected. Nevertheless, he said, Thank you. She walked home along the Arno embankment. She stopped at those very steps. She looked at them. Steps like steps. Wet stone. November. 5 years ago, a man sat here, feeling ill. Now this man sat in an Italian restaurant and spoke about architecture with a precision that cannot be found in books, only after years of attention. Liz stood there and looked at the dark water. Then she went home. They began working together a month later. The first project was a small chapel in Umbria, privately owned by an Italian family that had come under the management of a Qatari foundation as part of a rescue effort to save the estate from sale. Liz arrived, inspected the condition of the paintings, drew up a detailed restoration plan, cost estimate, and timeline. Everything was clear, without unnecessary words. The chapel was amazing. Small, rustic, with a low vaulted ceiling, painted by someone unknown at the end of the 15th century. The paintings were simple, not Michelangelo, but lively, warm, done with love by someone who clearly had no academic training, but had a keen sense of color. The central figure of the Madonna looked not downwards, as is customary, but straight ahead, almost defiantly, as if the artist had decided, let her look people in the eye. "This is the worst part," Liz said, pointing to the corner above the altar, where a crack in the plaster had torn part of the painting. "We'll have to consolidate the layer before working on the surface. Otherwise, any touch will cause more crumbling." "How long will it take?" Khalid asked. 3 months minimum. If we rush it, we'll ruin it. You can't rush restoration at all. It's the slowest job in the world." Khalid looked at her. "Do you know how to hurry?" "I can," Liz said, "but not here." Khalid was in Umbria that day. Not on purpose, he said, just passing through on business. Liz didn't believe it, but said nothing. He watched her work, how she removed a test piece of the surface, examined it through a magnifying glass, wrote something down in a small notebook, how she talked with the local priest, the elderly Don Sergio, about what exactly was important to preserve from a theological point of view, how she sat on the floor of the chapel and, in complete silence, looked for a long time at one detail of the painting. Don Sergio watched her with undisguised respect. Then he quietly said to Khalid in English, "She's genuine. People like her understand that their work is more important than themselves. That's rare." Khalid nodded. He understood what the old priest was talking about. "What are you thinking about?" he asked Liz quietly, when she stopped once again and stared at a detail of the Madonna for a long time. "That whoever painted this was 30 years old, tops," she said, not taking her eyes off the fresco. "Look at the movement of the hand here, that line. Only young people draw like that, when they're not afraid of making mistakes. Later, their hands become more careful." Khalid looked where she pointed. He didn't see what she saw. He didn't have that professional insight. But he heard the intonation with which she spoke, not like a tour guide who retells someone else's text, but like a person who feels. "Are you afraid of making a mistake?" he asked. She looked up. She looked at him with slight surprise, as if the question was unexpected. "Every day," she said simply. "When you take on someone else's work, you're always afraid of causing harm. It's the right fear. It makes you careful." Khalid was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I think I've been doing the opposite my whole life. I wasn't afraid to make mistakes, and that's why I was too rough." Liz looked at him carefully. She didn't ask what he meant. She just nodded. She knew how to accept such confessions without further ado. They worked on the chapel for 3 months. Liz came once a week. The rest of the time, her assistants Lorenzo and Anna Maria worked on site under her remote control. Khalid showed up there too. There was always some excuse. A meeting with the local municipality, a discussion with the owners about documentation, a tour of the neighboring building that the foundation was considering for its next project. Sometimes Khalid would show up at the chapel at the same time as Liz and just sit in the corner, reading or working on his laptop. At first, Liz thought it was a coincidence. Then she realized, no. But she kept quiet. She liked having him there. She liked being silent next to another person, without the obligation to speak. One day Lorenzo whispered to her with a conspiratorial air. "Capo, it seems your Qatari likes our chapel. He comes more often than necessary." "He's an investor," Liz replied dryly. "He has the right to oversee the project." Lorenzo grinned and said nothing. Anna Maria, who had seen everything and always remained silent, only looked up at Liz with such a look that Liz immediately turned back to her work. They often dined together after work meetings, in small local trattorias in Spoleto or Foligno, with the local wine, Sagrantino di Montefalco, and plates of Umbrian pasta with black truffle, the scent of which permeated the entire local cuisine. Liz drank wine. She wasn't religious in the strict sense. Khalid didn't, but Liz didn't comment on that, just as she didn't comment on anything about him. Over the meal they talked, at first only about work. Then the conversations began to expand, about architecture, about history, about what it means to preserve things or memories. One day, Liz told me about her grandfather Luigi and how he used to take her to his workshop as a child. "He never explained things in words," she said. "He just showed them. I still sometimes wonder, what would my grandfather have done here, in this place?" Khalid talked about London, about his 4 student years when he was just Khalid, that quiet guy from Qatar. "It was the only time in my life when I understood who I was, and not who I should be." "Why did you come back?" Liz asked. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said. "It was the family plan." "Do you have your own plan now?" He was silent. Then he smiled, rarely but beautifully. "It's starting to appear." Liz poured herself more wine, clinked glasses with his water. They didn't bother to clarify what they meant. That evening, when they were returning from Umbria in heavy rain and stood on the side of the road, Liz looked for a long time at the water flowing down the glass. She was thinking about something of her own. Then she quietly laughed. "What?" he asked. "Rain," she said. "When I found you on the embankment, it was raining too. Is it always with you?" Khalid looked at her, smiled, for the first time in a long time. For real, not for a business meeting, not out of politeness, but just because he wanted to. "It seems so," he said, "but you don't bring me soup from the osteria anymore." "I'm bringing you an Umbrian truffle," she replied. "I think that's a promotion." They both laughed. The rain pounded the roof of the car. It was warm and quiet. Outside the fogged-up windows were the Umbrian hills and bad weather. That evening he realized he didn't want to explain anything to this woman. He didn't want to justify anything. He didn't want to prove anything. He just wanted to be there, like that time in the rain, without unnecessary words. He was in no hurry. He knew that Liz was not someone who needed urgency. She lived at her own pace, the pace of a restorer who understands that good work takes time and is not nervous about it. He began coming to Florence more often, almost every 2 weeks. There were plenty of reasons. Projects were multiplying. The Al-Rashidi Heritage Foundation was expanding in the region. But they both understood that reasons are reasons. The hardest part was with my family. Khalid's mother learned about Liz 4 months later from a cousin who had been told something in Doha where everyone knew everyone. She called in the evening when Khalid was still in Florence. "Khalid, what's this story with the Italian woman?" "Mom, this isn't a story. This is the person I work with." "They say you see her every week." "They say it correctly." "She is not a Muslim?" "Yes." "Italian?" "Yes." Pause. Long. "Khalid, it will be very difficult for your father to accept this." "I know, Mom." "Are you serious?" He was silent. More seriously than ever in my life. Another pause. "Come, talk to him yourself. I won't explain it for you." He arrived in Doha a week later. The conversation with his father was difficult. Not because his father was shouting or threatening. Sheikh Faisal was not a man of action. But because he spoke quietly, and that made it harder. "Khalid, do you understand what you're doing?" His father asked over evening coffee in his office, where diplomas, photographs of presidents and czars, and models of completed buildings hung on the walls. "You're the eldest son. You're the face of the family. There was already a scandal after Noura. If you do it again—" "Father," Khalid interrupted quietly, "you're talking about the family's face. I want to talk about my life." His father looked at him in surprise. Khalid rarely interrupted. "I lived 40 years the right way," Khalid continued. "The right school, the right university, the right wife, the right job. I lost Noura precisely because I did everything right and didn't do anything real. I don't want to lose someone important to me again because I listened to what's right and not what's real." Father was silent. "That woman," Khalid said, "wasn't trying to impress me. She didn't know who I was when she first helped me. She simply brought me a hot meal in the rain because she couldn't pass it by. I've been looking for people like that my whole life, and I've rarely had them. I'm not going to let her go for the sake of her reputation." The father looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "You are sure?" "Sure." "Then invite her here. Let me see for myself." It was neither a verdict nor an approval. It was a pause before a decision. Khalid accepted it as a compromise. Liz learned about the family's difficult situation simply because Khalid told her himself, without embellishment or drama. "Is your father against it?" she asked. "He's in the process of acceptance," Khalid said. "He wants to see you." "That makes sense," Liz said. "I'd want to see the man I'm giving my daughter to, too, if I had a daughter." Khalid laughed. Then seriously, "Aren't you afraid?" "I'm afraid," Liz admitted. "But it's the right kind of fear. Remember what I said in chapel? The right kind of fear makes you neat. Not cowardly, neat. They're two different things." He took her hand and held it for a long time in silence. One Sunday, he showed up for no apparent reason. He simply wrote, "I'll be in Florence. Can you show me something they don't show tourists?" She replied half an hour later, "Tomorrow at 8 in the morning, Piazza Santo Spirito. No tie." He arrived at 8, wearing a simple shirt and good shoes. She was already waiting for him with a thermos of coffee, which she poured for him without ceremony. Here we drink coffee standing up. That's the right way to do it. She showed him the courtyard of the Santo Spirito Monastery, where admission is only by appointment through the gatekeeper, with whom she had a good relationship since the studio restored several frames for the monastery's sacristy. She showed him the small artisans' quarter behind the Ponte Vecchio, where tourists rarely go. An old shoemaker, a bookbinder, an engraver. She took him to a small bar on Borgo Santi Apostoli, where the local old men drink espresso and grappa at 7 in the morning and discuss the politician they've hated for 20 years. They didn't fit in at all. A tall man with Arab features and a Florentine woman with lime-stained hands. Khalid liked it better than the Uffizi. When they came out, Khalid said, "I realized you were showing me a living city, not a museum." "Florence isn't a museum," Liz replied seriously. "It's the townspeople who get really angry when people call them that. People live here. People die here. People fall in love here. People argue over parking here. This is life, and it just so happens to be surrounded by masterpieces." "Or masterpieces are accidentally written into life," he said. Liz looked at him with unexpected respect. "That's more accurate, yes." They reached the Ponte Vecchio. They stopped. They looked down at the water, then at the hills in the haze. "Can I ask you a personal question?" Khalid said. "Yes, I can. I may not answer." "Why did you stop then? On the embankment. Most people's reflex is to pass by." Liz was silent for a few seconds. Then, "My father used to say, don't pass by anything that's clearly wrong, not because it's your business, but because it's a person." He said this about frescoes, too. If you see a crack, stop. You don't necessarily have to fix it right away. Just look. That alone means something. "And I looked like a crack," he said quietly. "Yes," Liz said simply. He was silent for a long time. Then, "This is the most accurate description I heard about myself during that period." They walked back in silence. Autumn leaves floated down the river. Florence glowed in the November sun. One evening in Umbria, after work in the chapel, when they were eating in a small trattoria and it was raining outside, Liz suddenly asked, "Khalid, your wife, do you miss her?" He looked up. He wasn't surprised by the question. He thought honestly. Quote 110, quote, he said. Quote 111, quote. "And have you learned now?" "I don't know," he said. "I'm trying. I'm learning to notice. I'm learning to be there. I'm learning to be silent with someone, not just silent alone." Liz looked at him. "You've been silent to me now," she said, "for most of the evening." "I know," he said. "And this is the first time in my life that silence around another person feels right, not awkward." Liz looked out the window at the rain for a long time. Then she said, "My father and mother were silent like that their whole lives. They could sit next to each other for 3 hours, he restoring, she working with fabric, and barely speak. But it was complete silence, not empty. When they were gone, the first thing that killed me was that there was no one left to hear in the silence." Khalid didn't say anything. He just took her hand and held it. "I think," he said finally, "that's exactly what I've been looking for all along. Not conversations. Just being in silence with someone who doesn't have anything to prove." "It's harder than it looks," Liz said. "I know." "Why?" "Because to do that, you have to stop defending yourself. And I defended myself for a very long time." The rain pounded the glass. Outside the window, the Umbrian hills were drowning in darkness. They ate pasta with truffle and drank water, she wine, he without. And everything was fine. In November, exactly 5 years after that night on the Arno embankment, they walked together along the same route. Evening, light rain, dark river. Khalid stopped at those very steps. He looked at them. "Right here," he said quietly. Liz also stopped. She looked. Steps like steps, wet stone, a small patch of rain. "You're still sitting here," she said. "Inside, yes?" He didn't understand right away. Then he understood. "No," he said, "not anymore. I left there that evening after I ate some hot rosemary soup." Liz laughed. Then she became serious. She looked at him. "Khalid," she began, "I want to tell you something. Can I tell you straight out?" "Always," he said. I'm not used to what's been going on between us these past few months. I'm used to working. I'm used to tools, to frescoes, to debts and deadlines. I'm not very good at all this." She waved her hand awkwardly. "Meetings in the rain, restaurants in Umbria. It scares me a little." Khalid looked at her. She spoke with a childish awkwardness. This confident, straightforward, unperturbed woman suddenly became embarrassed. "Liz," he said quietly, "I spent 45 years doing what was right, not what was real. That's why I lost my wife. That's why I sat here alone in the rain. I'm not very good at it either, but I think we're both about as bad as each other. That's a good place to start." She looked at him for a few seconds. Then she nodded quietly. He took her hand, carefully, as if he were picking up something fragile. She didn't take her hand away. They stood at the steps above the Arno, and the rain fell over the city that 500 years ago taught the world to think about beauty. The next months were not easy. Liz is a person who takes time. She didn't rush into a relationship, didn't rush things. Khalid quickly realized this and accepted it. He himself was a person who had forgotten how to rush. He flew to Florence. She sometimes went to Doha, first on business for the foundation, to look at Qatari projects that could become part of their collaboration, then simply. Doha at first weighed on her. Too big, too fast-paced, too new a city for a person who grew up among medieval stones. But Khalid showed her what he himself loved, the old quarter of Al-Mashairib, where several traditional houses remained, the Museum of Islamic Art with its amazing interior by Pei, the Qatari market, Souk Waqif, with the scent of cardamom and saffron. Once they went to the desert, stayed there overnight in a traditional tent under the stars, which are not visible in the city. Liz lay and looked at the sky and did not say a word for 2 hours. Then she quietly said, "I understand where you came from." He did not ask what it meant. He understood himself. She met her mother, Camelia, who had come from Romania for a few weeks and found him a perfectly acceptable, if surprising, choice for her daughter. "You're not like your mother," she told Liz after their first dinner. "She always fell in love with ordinary people. You fell in love with a sheikh. That's strange for Moretto, but he has good eyes." Liz laughed. "Mom, I fell in love with a man sitting on wet steps in the rain. Sheikh is just his job title." Liz flew to Doha in February. She'd never been to Qatar before. In the Arab world, she'd only been to Morocco on a student excursion, and Jordan, where she went to see the Petrine frescoes. Doha looked strange from the plane. Huge glass towers in the desert, wide avenues, almost devoid of pedestrians. People here get around in cars. Khalid met her at the airport himself, without a driver. It was his decision. She understood that. They drove through the new district towards the bay, and Liz looked out the window in silence. "I understand," he said, "that this is not at all what you are used to." "It's different," she said carefully. "I'm not saying worse. It's just very different." "Are you comfortable here?" She thought honestly. "It's not clear yet. Give it a few days." He gave. For the first 2 days, he showed her what he knew and what wasn't visible from the tourist route. The old quarter of Al-Mushairib, where several traditional houses made of coral limestone stand, preserved during the large-scale reconstruction of the quarter. Al-Bastakia in Doha, a tiny enclave of traditional architecture with wind towers, exactly like those in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. The Museum of Islamic Art, with Pei's interior, vast, austere, permeated with light. Liz truly came to life in the museum. She walked slowly, closely, examining the fine wood carvings, Persian miniatures, early Arabic manuscripts with initials. "This," she said quietly, standing before a large wooden panel with a geometric pattern, "is made using the same principle as the mosaics in Ravenna, the same mathematical order, only a different language." "You see connections where others see differences," Khalid noted. "It's professional," she said. "Restorers look for structure. All great cultures have the same structure." The meeting with Khalid's father took place on the 3rd day. Dinner in the family house, large in the traditional Arabic style, with an inner courtyard where palm trees grew and a small fountain gurgled. Sheikh Faisal turned out to be short, with a round face, not at all like his eldest son. He met Liz in the living room, where photographs of the family for several generations hung on the walls. He greeted her in English, politely, without warmth or coldness, neutrally, like a man who had not yet decided. At dinner, they talked about Italy, about Florentine architecture. This was interesting to her father. He was a builder himself. About her grandfather, Luigi, and the studio. Liz didn't try to please. She simply talked, the way she knew how. Directly, without unnecessary words, with humor where it was appropriate, and without it where it was inappropriate. At some point, Sheikh Faisal asked unexpectedly, "Elizabeth, did you know who Khalid was when you first brought him food on the embankment?" "No," Liz replied. "I saw a man who was cold, nothing more." "And if you knew?" Liz thought honestly. "I would have brought soup anyway, just because that's what people do." Sheikh Faisal looked at her. Then he nodded slowly, once, like a man who has decided something for himself. They did not return to this topic again that evening. When Liz and Khalid were leaving, Sheikh Faisal came out to see them to the car, himself, which was a sign of respect. He shook Liz's hand. "Nice to meet you, Elizabeth." "Likewise," she said simply. In the car, Khalid said, "This means that he accepted." "How do you know?" "He doesn't come out to see off those he doesn't accept." That night, as Doha glowed outside the hotel window, Liz couldn't sleep for a long time. She thought about what she'd seen over the past 3 days, the vast new city, the traditional neighborhood, the old family dinner, her stern father with kind eyes deep in his eyes. She thought about how different Khalid's world was, and how, at the same time, they both stood in the museum, equally silent, in front of the geometric patterns. The The structure of all great cultures is the same. On the fourth day, they went into the desert. Khalid knew a place 2 hours' drive from the city where a family friend kept a small camp. A few traditional tents, a hand pump with water, a fire pit made of stones. No people, only the desert, the wind, and silence. They lit a small fire. Liz sat, hugging her knees, and looked at the fire. Then at the stars. Endless. Impossible. The kind you don't see in the city. "I see where you came from," she finally said quietly. "What do you mean?" he asked. She was silent. How to choose the words? "You're a person of vast spaces," she said. "You have it in you. This emptiness that doesn't oppress but liberates. At first I didn't understand where it came from. Now I understand." He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "And you are a man of small details. You have the ability to see what's important where others pass by. It comes from your stones, from your frescoes." Liz smiled. "Maybe that's why we're a good fit. A large space and a small detail. They need each other." "Without a detail, space is empty," he said. "And a detail without space suffocates," she added. They looked at the fire. Then he took her hand, and she didn't take it away. The stars were close. It was a moment that both of them later remembered for a long time as the beginning of the present. They married 2 years after that November night on the steps. The wedding was modest, she insisted, in a small old villa on the hills of Fiesole, above Florence, with a view of Brunelleschi's dome. About 20 guests. Mother Camelia, Liz's grandmother, still alive, 90 years old, from Romania, shocked by this Arab magnate who looks at my granddaughter as a work of art. Anna Maria from the atelier in a white lace blouse. Lorenzo with his wife. A few Florentine friends Liz had known since university. A few of Khalid's people, those he considered real friends, not business connections. Khalid's mother flew in from Qatar, an elegant woman in an expensive abaya, who at first eyed Liz warily. Then she came up to her, took her hands in hers, looked at her lime-stained palms, and said in Arabic, smiling, "The hands of a hard worker. That's a good sign." Liz understood her intonation, even though she didn't know Arabic, and smiled back. The Moretto e Figli Atelier continued to operate in the same building in Oltrarno. It was now officially a partner of the Al-Rashidi Heritage Foundation, with additional funding and several ongoing projects in Italy, Spain, and Morocco. Liz hired 2 new restorers and expanded the workshop into an adjacent room, which could now be rented from her own premises. Anna Maria taught the young artisans gilding the same way her grandfather Luigi had taught her, patiently, sternly, with stories about each tool. Khalid retained the foundation's Florence office, small, 2 blocks from the studio. He didn't become a man who came and changed everything. He became a man who fit into the rhythm of other people's lives, respecting them. 3 years later, they had a daughter. They named her Luisa, in memory of her grandfather, Luigi. Little Luisa grew up between Florence and Doha, speaking Italian with her mother, Arabic with her father, and English with the television. In her childhood room in the Florentine house, there were jars of pigments, closed, out of reach. A small easel that her grandmother, Camelia, had bought, and a large old book with reproductions of Florentine frescoes, which her father read aloud to her every evening, telling her about each character in the pictures. One day, when Louise was 4 years old, Liz took her to the studio. Little Louise stood at the large work table and watched her mother work with a very fine brush on the edge of an old frame. Then she asked, "Mom, why are you fixing this? It's old." Liz smiled, lowered her brush. "Because old doesn't mean useless," she said. "It means it's lived a long time. And if it's lived a long time, it means there was something important in it. Our job is to help it live longer." Louise thought. Then she nodded seriously. "How about people?" Liz looked at her in surprise. Then she laughed. "Yes, dear, just like with people." That same evening, Khalid came home from the office. Liz told him about the conversation. He laughed quietly, then thought for a moment, then said, "You know, it's true. I think that's exactly what you've been doing from the very beginning. First, with the old frescoes, then with me." Liz looked at him. She shook her head. "You weren't broken, Khalid. You were just sitting in the rain and didn't know it was time to get up." He hugged her. Outside the window, it was a Florentine night. Lights were burning above the Arno. Beyond the river, the hill with Piazzale Michelangelo was black, and above the city stood the silhouette of Brunelleschi's dome, the same as 500 years ago. Then came the morning, and the next day, and again, November over the river. Louise was 6 when Khalid took her and Liz to Doha for the first time, for a month. For Louise, it was a revelation. A different sky, a different smell, a different sound. She walked with her father through the Al-Mushaireb quarter and touched the stones with her hands, just as her mother had done with the frescoes. Khalid noticed this and watched silently, with that expression Liz had long recognized. Happiness mixed with surprise that it was even possible. In Doha, they had a small block in a residential complex not far from the old souk. Not a mansion. Liz rejected the idea of a mansion right away. We'd get lost and sad there. But 3 spacious rooms with high ceilings and a view of the bay. On the kitchen shelf stood a bronze chesve, the very same antique one from Khalid's family, which his mother had given him when she learned he was getting married. "This was my grandmother's," Khalid's mother said, handing it over. "She brewed coffee in it for 30 years. Let your house have coffee like this too." Liz took the chesve with both hands as if she were taking something precious. Then she quietly asked Khalid when her mother left, "Will you teach me how to cook properly?" "You give me restoration. I give you coffee," he said. It became their separate ritual. In the morning, when they were both in Doha, Khalid would brew coffee himself, slowly, unhurriedly, in that very same old chesve, with cardamom and rose water. He would place it in front of Liz. She would drink it without saying anything, simply holding the cup with both hands. Lorenzo, meanwhile, had risen in the workshop from assistant to full partner. After 5 years, Liz suggested they turn the studio into a joint venture, Moretto e Rinaldi. Lorenzo was at a loss. "Liz, this is your family's business." "Lorenzo, you've been working here for 5 years, the way only those who care about this work. This is yours, too." Lorenzo agreed. His wife, Giulia, brought a bottle of Prosecco, and the 4 of them celebrated. Liz, Khalid, Lorenzo, Giulia, at the studio table, among the tools and pigment samples. "Grandpa would approve," Liz said, raising her glass. "My father would certainly approve," Lorenzo added. "He always said, a good business depends on people, not on a name." Liz nodded. She sipped her Prosecco. It was raining outside. November, Florentine, with the scent of Arno. The years flowed by calmly and fully. Louise grew up, smart, willful, fluent in 3 languages, knowing the smell of gesso and the names of every tool in her mother's studio, and the purpose of every tower in Qatari architecture that her father showed her. At 17, she spent the summer at a restoration center in Rome, an internship that Liz had arranged through old connections. At 19, she took her first independent trip to Tunisia to see the Arab architecture she had read about in her father's books. "Aren't you afraid to let her go alone?" Khalid asked. "She knows what she's doing," Liz said. "She's our daughter. She'll do something good." Louise entered Bologna at 23, just like her mother had done before. It became a family tradition, unplanned. It just happened that way. Restoration, Bologna, the smell of drying oil, and youth. That evening, when Louise left for Bologna, Liz stood for a long time in her empty nursery in the Florentine house. She looked at the easel, at the closed jars of pigments, at the old book of frescoes that Khalid was reading aloud to her. Khalid entered quietly and stood next to her. "That's right," he said. "I know," Liz said. "It's just the first time." "Do you remember how you left yourself?" "I remember. My father brought me to the station. He said, 'Finally, the city was bored.' We laughed. Then he left. I watched him go for a long time." Khalid took her hand. They stood in the nursery, which suddenly became so empty. "Thank God," he said quietly, "that we were smart enough not to hold her back." "Restoration teaches," Liz said, "not to hold back, only to support." They left the nursery together. In the kitchen, Khalid put the chesve on the fire. When Louise was 27, the same age Liz had been when she first entered the studio herself after her father's death, she called from Bologna. "Mom, I was invited to do an internship in Amman at the Royal Institute's Islamic Manuscripts Restoration Project." Liz was silent for a few seconds. Then she said, "When?" "In March." "For how long?" "For a year." Silence. "That's wonderful," Liz said. "Are you coming?" "You don't mind?" "Louisa, this is Amman. These are 15th century manuscripts. You must go. Father will be happy. He has an old friend there, the director of the institute. They met 10 years ago at a conference." Louise laughed into the phone. Then she said quietly, "Mom, do you know that you are the best?" Liz smiled. "This is your grandmother, Camellia. Tell her, too." More years passed. Khalid, at 60, handed over the operational management of the Al-Rashidi Heritage Foundation to Louise, officially, with his own board of directors, at a gala dinner in Doha, attended by the entire family from both sides. Sheikh Faisal, who was by then in his 80s, stood up and delivered a speech, briefly in Arabic, then in English for the Florentine guests. "Khalid, you were right. I'm glad you didn't listen to me then." The audience applauded. Liz didn't leave the workshop. She simply began taking on fewer new projects and devoting more time to training young restorers. She was already known in professional circles, not loudly, not to the general public, but among those involved in heritage conservation in Italy and the Mediterranean. She was occasionally offered academic positions, honorary memberships. She politely declined. "I work with my hands. If I stop, what good is the position?" Every November, He and Khalid would come to the Arno embankment. One day, Louise, already an adult, came with them. They stood at those steps, looking at the river. "You always come here," said Louise. "I remember from childhood. Why?" Khalid and Liz exchanged glances. "Because this is where it started," Khalid said. "What started?" "That's it," he said simply. Louise looked at them, at her mother with dirty hands, even on a day off, at her father, who held her hand as if he was afraid he wouldn't be able to hold it, at the river, dark and quiet, at the lights of the bridge in the distance. "I want to know this story," she said. "That's right, from the beginning." "With hot minestrone?" Liz asked. "With hot minestrone," Louise nodded. They went to the osteria on the corner. They sat at a small table. They ordered soup, the same one with rosemary and potatoes, the same smell. Khalid held the glass in his hands and looked at it for a few seconds in silence. Then he looked up at his wife. Liz smiled, and he began to tell. This, the ability to notice another person at the right moment, is what researcher Brené Brown, a professor of social work at the University of Houston, has dedicated more than 20 years to studying what she calls vulnerability and authentic connection. In her work, which became the basis for one of the most viewed TED Talks in the platform's history, Brown described a paradox. People are most afraid of being seen, truly, with all their fatigue, weakness, uncertainty. And at the same time, this is precisely what they want most. She showed that those who allow themselves to be seen, who don't hide their vulnerability behind a business suit or a professional mask, they are the ones who ultimately build deep, genuine connections with other people. Khalid spent 5 years building mirrored facades and perfect marriages, not allowing anyone to see the real him. Until one November, he found himself on wet steps above the river, and someone simply brought him soup. Without asking his name, without demanding an explanation, just seeing a person. Sometimes one such moment is enough for everything to start changing. Years passed. Florence remained itself. The dark stones of the Oltrarno, the scent of the Arno in the mornings, the sound of the bells of Santo Spirito, the market in Piazza Santa Croce on Fridays. The Moretto e Rinaldi studio now occupied the entire second floor of the historic building. Lorenzo convinced Liz to expand when there were more orders than they could handle. Young restorers came for internships, from Bologna, from Rome, once from Madrid. Liz taught them the same way her grandfather had taught them, without unnecessary words, through her hands, through attention. At 60, Khalid handed over the operational management of the Al-Rashidi Heritage Foundation to Louise. Officially, with a gala dinner in Doha, Sheikh Faisal had already left by then, quietly, in the old family home with its palm trees in the courtyard. But he managed to tell Louise, "You are our bridge. This is what your mother did with her hands. Now you do it with an organization." Louise laughed. "Dad, that's almost literally the word mom. I think it's her influence." Liz smiled without interrupting. Grandfather Luigi's tools still stood behind the large workbench in the workshop, the very ones Marco hadn't thrown away, and Liz had carried from the old workshop to the new one as a relic. An old clearing knife with a wooden handle darkened by time, a small hammer for consolidating plaster, an awl with a bone handle. Liz didn't use them. They were too old for modern work, but she didn't put them away either. They stood in plain sight in a small wooden box on the edge of the table. One day, a young intern asked, "Signora Liz,
What are those tools in the box? Nobody uses them.
These are Grandpa's, Liz said. He opened this studio in '72.
Why don't you remove them?
Because they remind me that I'm not the first here, Liz said, and not the last, and that everything I do is part of something bigger that started before me. The intern nodded. She remembered. Khalid came to the studio several times a week when he was in Florence. Sometimes he'd just sit in the corner with his laptop and work next to her while she restored. It was his version of presence, silent, close. Liz got used to it and stopped noticing. Or rather, she did notice, but like you notice your own breath. Without it, nothing exists, but you rarely think about it. One evening, when the workshop was empty and it was getting dark outside the Oltrarno window, Khalid looked up from his laptop and suddenly said,
Liz, have you ever regretted it?
About what? About getting involved with someone from another world, with all the flights, Doha, family complications, journalists. Liz put down her brush, looked at him.
Khalid, she said, I live in a city where every other stone is someone else's legacy, entrusted to me for safekeeping. I'm used to the fact that good things aren't always of my own making. Sometimes they come from another world, and the challenge is to preserve them, not lose them. Khalid was silent for a long time. Then he stood up, walked up to her, and kissed her temple. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For the rosemary soup, for everything that came after. Outside the window, the November Arno was noisy. If you liked this story, please leave your thoughts in the comments and give it a like. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to stay up to date with new stories. Until next time.